The cover page of One Piece Chapter 1078 features Judge Vinsmoke and Caesar Clown forming a new alliance known as Neo-Mads. These two were just at each other's necks, but are now sworn allies as Sanji's siblings don't seem very interested. Returning to Egghead Island, we have an injured Sentomaru speaking with someone over Denden Mushi, surprised to hear Admiral Kizaru's name mentioned. We still don't know how deep their relationship really is, but Sentomaru has always called him uncle. On the second floor of Building B, this person is revealed to be Stussy, with Jinbei nearby. She would relay the information that CP0's objective was the elimination of Dr. Vegapunk, which would then be followed by Admiral Kizaru's arrival. Sentomaru would make note of how prepared the world government seems to be when it comes to this operation, which Stussy would explain was on account of the situation's severity being even greater than Ohara's. As we saw from the flashback of Vegapunk and Monkey D. Dragon after Ohara's destruction, the Doctor obtained their Forbidden Void Century research and continued it. Because he got their research decades before, just imagine how much Vegapunk must know by now. In fact, the first time he saw Luffy's Gear 5th, he immediately connected it to the legendary Sun God Nika. The other reason for the severity of the world government's intended attack is that Egghead Island actually possesses a resistance force, unlike Ohara. They have countless futuristic weapons and defenses. An entire army of advanced pacifista have just been deployed. As Stussy and Jinbei continue to launch forward and onward, the importance of this Denden Mushi line is emphasized as all other communications have been destroyed. From there, in the Fabio Phase Factory, Sentomaru would continue his declaration to the Egghead workers. He'd tell them all to learn from history and avoid the Navy's onslaught by escaping while they still can. They don't have any time to waste or hesitate. With that, the many denizens of Egghead Island would rush off in a panic, intending to do as Sentomaru told them and escape the island before the Navy arrives. Hopefully things go well for them here, and we can avoid the deaths of escaping civilians like we saw from Ohara. But given the nature of the information at stake, it's hard to imagine an Akainu-led Navy letting even a single one of these researchers escape. Moving over to the third floor of Building C, we'd have Franky calling out for Usopp and Lilith. Semi-petrified, Franky would wind his arm up while reprimanding a snake. He'd demand she unpetrify him, as apparently his right side was off guard, but his left side is just fine. I'm not sure why this is the case for him specifically, but maybe it has to do with his somewhat mechanical anatomy. Maybe this is a limitation of Hancock's Devil Fruit. Franky would give S-Snake one more chance to make things right, promising to forgive them if they simply undo what they've done. However, S-Snake's attention would be drawn elsewhere and towards another one of the Vegapunks, Pythagoras, who was very frustrated and pained by this ordeal. With tears in his robotic eyes, he'd question why the Seraphim was doing this and on whose orders. But the artificial lifeform has nothing to say in this chapter and instead lifted her hefty boot above him. Franky would cry out for the little Vegapunk and be forced to watch in horror as a despicable crunch would be heard. This was then followed by a massive explosion and S-Snake moving on. Struggling against the blast fallout, Franky would plead with the Seraphim not to leave as her face provided no emotions. On the second floor of Building A, we'd have Chopper, Atlas, and Robin, who is unfortunately on the verge of experiencing yet another genocidal event. Chopper would express his hope that everyone is alright, despite all the explosions and screaming. It was clear to Robin that the Seraphim were causing trouble, but Atlas was still in disbelief towards these events. Robin wasn't all too worried about Nami since her screams will always be accompanied by a rescue from Sanji. Instead, they needed to take advantage of the fact that they are not restricted like the others are. Right now, ensuring Stella's safety is their top priority, which Chopper happily agreed with. This conversation then prompted Atlas to recall a lab of theirs that hasn't been used in quite a while. Despite their brilliance, the Vegapunks seem to have completely overlooked this location, what we know to be the abandoned Devil Fruit Research Lab. Deciding to go there, Chopper and Robin would have Atlas lead the way. On the third floor of Building A, Nami would try her best to keep Edison alive as Brook decided to make use of his soul form and go looking for Stella. But just as he decided to do that, he'd be shocked by Sanji's actions. And reasonably so, as with his arms folded, Sanji was able to tank a direct punch from S-Shark to the face. With his eyebrows still reversed, Sanji would question if the creature understands the power of love. For Sanji's face to not even be dented here tells us that either his genetic modifications have matured even further than before, or he's making use of them in combination with armament hockey. On the fourth floor of Building A, Zoro and Luffy were panting for breath, struggling to handle their own Seraphim opponents on account of the flames on their backs not going out. But before the Sanji fans take this moment too far, the two seem to be conserving as much of their strength as they can. Zoro, for instance, is only using 2 of his swords while keeping Wado Ichimonji on his back. But instead of worrying about that, Luffy would cry out that S-Hawks managed to escape, much to everyone's shock. Rob Lucci, being the most tactical member of their newly formed alliance, would theorize that S-Hawk must have changed the order of his targeting to focus on the weaker forces instead of the strongest. Now this behavior is very different from the man he's based on, Dracula Mihawk, since Mihawk doesn't really bother with weaklings and enjoys a proper challenge. Continuing his cold yet rational assessment, Lucci would further elaborate that Luffy's friends would now be in increased danger, as taking them out would only stand to weaken the crew's morale. Before Luffy could respond, Zoro was already insistent on pursuing S-Hawk, telling his captain to leave it to him. Hearing this, Luffy would pretty much order Kaku to follow after him since Zoro tends to get lost easily. And hilariously, Luffy does this while referring to Kaku as Usopp, on account of the similarly long nose. As Kaku angrily gave chase, Luffy would continue to futilely attack S-Bear, this time with Hawk Gatling in hopes that it would be able to extinguish the flames on S-Bear's back that were aiding in his durability. But Lucci wasn't a fan of this approach, as he'd reprimand the pirate and demand that he use his head instead of just throwing out attacks. From here, the narrative would become very heavy and foreboding, as it would describe this to be the day before the soon-to-be famous Egghead Incident. Visually, we would then have Droolery Bonnie in the midst of embracing her father's history and pain as she shook with tears flooding her eyes. The events leading up to this point began 3 months ago. From here, we would flash back to the Holy Land of Mary Joa. At the time, an unknown caller from Egghead Island would seek communication with their higher-ups. This person would reveal to the elders that Dr. Vegapunk was secretly investigating the Void Sentry. In response to this claim, CP5 was sent to investigate. But with no evidence having been found, they should have been in the clear. But this traitor was crafty. Unbeknownst to Stella and the others, the ship that the agents departed on mysteriously disappeared. This development unsettled the world government and resulted in the dispatch of CP7 and CP8 to follow up. And yet again, none of the agents managed to return to the world government. After this, the mysterious traitor would make yet another call with the very same intent. This time they were granted an audience with the 5 elders over Denden Mushi. It was through this conversation that Vegapunk's betrayal became clear to them. And once that became the case, he was marked for death. To ensure the fulfillment of this, CP0 was sent to Egghead. And as the rumors have it, when CP0 is involved, world-shaking events are on the verge of occurring. Expecting resistance from Vegapunk, one of the 5 elders, St. J. Garcia Saturn, decided to personally set sail to Egghead with Admiral Kizaru as his escort. This could mean that perhaps the elders are in fact pretty strong themselves. Or it may be on account of the Seraphim being involved, since the Gorosei have the highest level of authority over them. In addition to this, several branches of the Navy have been called in as reinforcements for this major event. This impending war was already bound to put the destruction of Ohara to shame. But to complicate matters even further was the unexpected appearance of the Yonko Monkey D. Luffy and his crew. Dealing with a Yonko here would only add to the uncertainty and danger of this event, but they couldn't afford to turn back now. It's all or nothing. And the Gorosei are clearly tired of Luffy's problematic streak, as the mere thought of his jovial sun god form unsettled them. To end this forewarning of events to come, we would have the declaration that the outcome would give the entire world an unthinkable shock. The time to be hyped is now. One way or another, it is very likely that we will be receiving more details on the Void Sentry than ever before. We also have the fact that Stella's dream is to share all his knowledge with the world, effectively inventing the Internet of One Piece. Between that and the recent involvement of Big News Morgans, whatever the world learns from this event is bound to be on par with Whitebeard's declaration that the One Piece is real. Now imagine if something bad happens to one of the 5 elders. Picking up inside the Devil Fruit lab, where Shaka had just been shot in the head by an unseen assailant, a caged Stella would cry out in disbelieving horror. As the mysterious figure drew closer and closer, Stella would demand that they answer him. But when they finally came into view, he was dumbfounded. The traitor would then reveal himself to be none other than Vegapunk York. With a massive pistol in her hands and an unsettling smile on her face, she'd greet her creator while declaring that she's going to become a celestial dragon. The mere notion of this angered and disgusted Stella, as York has been to the Holy Land and has seen the depravity of the Celestials firsthand. He couldn't understand such a desire, which is interesting since she was made using his own brain. Her entire job and purpose has been to lounge about, eating, sleeping, and taking dumps, despite possessing an intellect on par with that of her siblings. She has all the behaviors of a celestial dragon in that sense, and may harbor resentment towards the others who get to invent and have fun together. But I seriously wonder if the world government will actually make her a celestial dragon if all goes well. We've never heard of such a thing before, and not even Doflamingo was able to re-enter their society. Ultimately, York is a Vegapunk of greed. There is no greater desire to be had for such a person than to become a celestial dragon. The only thing that could possibly come close would be the desire to be the only Vegapunk and never have to share the world's affection and admiration again. Not to mention that being a celestial dragon would eliminate virtually all the restrictions and issues the Vegapunks currently face when it comes to their research. They would have unlimited money and could conduct almost any experiment, no matter how unjust. Whatever the case, I just hope that such a smart character at least has some insurance on this deal or something. York pretended to be taken down, petrified by a snake, and used that lacking suspicion to make her way here and continue her plans. Maybe she was able to warp like we saw Stella do with his introduction. Stella's words here made York laugh, as he sounded just like Shaka to her. Feeling no remorse for killing what was essentially her sibling, York would continue to laugh over his death. Not sure how such a tiny bullet emerged from such a huge pistol, but York would follow this up by mentioning how confusing it is to have so many Vegapunks in the world. As Stella remained horrified, York would keep smiling, saying that the world would be better off with only one of them instead. Hopefully Brook, Robin, Chopper, and Atlas can make it to this location, but with how bad Zoro is at directions, he might end up there first. As always, I'm Celestial Otaku. Thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.